Florida.
And we are going to discuss some topics about the deaf community. The first thing that we would like to talk about is the diversity that is occurring in the deaf community. I feel that that there is a lot of diversity. For example, there's 43% white, 12% African American, about 12% Hispanic, and 3% Asian. And this really matches up with the ethnicity in the United States just in general. But there's also a different kind of diversity of how they communicate. So some people choose to do ASL with no speaking, some like the total communication, and then there's those that use a English-based sign system. And so overall, there's just a lot of diversity within the community.
According to Sheets' book, Deaf in the 21st Century, on pages 28 and 29, she writes about the percentages of the deaf student population. It states that approximately 23.5% of students who are deaf speak and write languages other than the English language at home. I live in South Florida, where we have a large deaf community, and within that deaf community, the majority of those I have met are either Hispanic or Indian. It can become difficult trying to sign with these individuals, especially if either of us have to fingerspell a word, because English is not their first language. So I agree, it is very diverse.
I agree. And a lot of the information that I received was from the book by Dr. Sheets, but I've also met just different individuals in the deaf community. And one of those, we're kind of talking about the issue of people that are deaf with a additional disability. And I've talked with an interpreter who, she is deaf herself, but she interprets for a deaf student. So there's a hearing interpreter that signs what the teacher's saying, and then she signs to the deaf student because it is in a way that he can understand it. And she's also interpreted for a deaf and blind student where she signs through touch. And for the first time, he is able to really communicate what he thinks because she's meeting his needs. And as a teacher or an interpreter, I think it's important to understand the additional disability to make sure they have access to the education.
I agree. And while watching the video Unrealized Dreams, I realized that even if an individual has additional disabilities, they can still hold down a job. Jenny was almost blind and deaf, but when given the right tools to work with, she was able to do her job very effectively. If I were an interpreter for someone with Jenny's disabilities, I would try to help by providing a magnifying glass to see the words more clearly, as they did in the video, and use larger text where possible to assist in the reading material. So I agree with Elizabeth that you must first get to know the person and try to adjust your style to fit their needs.
And that kind of leads into our next discussion topic of how education has changed over the past 50 years. Starting out, it was very, students were only taught oral method for a long time and no sign language, to then there was deaf schools, and then now it's very mainstream to a point that about 85% of deaf students are in a mainstream setting, which I disagree that this is not always the best situation for children. They are not able to be around the deaf culture if they are mainstreamed. And also in Dr. Sheets' book, it stated that majority of teachers of the deaf are white hearing females, so they really don't have that role model of looking up to a deaf adult and how to live in the deaf community, especially if they're a deaf minority. So I feel that sometimes mainstream isn't the best choice.
I think 50 years ago, being deaf was something individuals were embarrassed about, honestly. I think they did not have the resources available and the support that they deserved. They were basically put on the back burner as if though they had the plague. Today, I think being deaf is not seen as something so terrible. There are so many programs out there that will help, such as schools for the deaf, clubs, organizations, and things like that. It's not all mainstream. So I agree that it has changed.
Yes, and then our last topic is, has technology created a divide or in the community or brought it closer together? And again, listening to a speaker who works for the Deaf Commission in the state of Kansas, who himself is deaf, he believes that technology can actually make a gap because there's so many different forms of way to communicate. Before the deaf community would gather in the public and come together in meetings. Now some use email, some use video phones, some prefer text messaging. So now there's these little groups of people instead of bringing them together in the community, which means the hearing community is not getting much exposure to the deaf community.
While reading Deaf in the 21st Century on pages 34 through 36, I noticed there were many technological advances that impacted the deaf community. Closed captioning was the first, which came about in the 70s and made it possible for the deaf community to be able to watch television and understand what was going on. In my opinion, this was a great advancement so they could be more informed. However, over the years, things like computers and cell phones may have helped the deaf community, but they could also hinder them. Because as Elizabeth said, there's going to be much less face-to-face interactions. So I agree that it has divided the deaf community from the hearing world.
Overall, I think these resources have really helped us to see different sides of these discussion topics.
I agree.